Hey there, happy Friday. Welcome to my studio here in New York City. I'm Daniel Norton, photographer. And if you're new to the channel, go ahead and subscribe and ring the bell if you're interested in videos about photography, about the philosophy of business, about creativity. That kind of stuff is what we talk about here. So this one I'm going to try to handle with a talk, although maybe this is better suited for a demo. I'm not sure because I feel like I've done many demos showing this and I still get the question over and over again. And I wonder if that's because when you do a demonstration, you are still doing it in a very specific space and a very specific time. So the question is, wondering what I'm talking about, is I got a question, this was a while ago, I'm sorry, the person who sent it to me, it's been forever, I made a note and I never went through it and made a video, even though I said I was going to. The idea of having two people in your photo, a group shot essentially, of two people that are starkly different skin tone. So generally speaking, my answer to this is if you're lighting a group, so you're lighting them evenly, like if I metered myself and I was properly exposed and I metered somebody next to me who was, let's say, a much lighter skin tone and they were, the same exposure, and the person over here was, a much darker skin tone and they were the, proper exposure. So let's say my camera's set at f8, 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 f8. When you make the photo, that should be all that matters. And there is this thing that kind of stays with photography about the idea of making adjustments for skin tone because a couple of reasons. And we're going to talk about that, and I think hopefully this will help. Early on, well, first of all, period, if you're using a meter that's in your camera, you're using what's called a reflected light meter. If you're using a reflected light meter, what it's doing is it's looking at the part of the image that it's metering, so let's say my black t-shirt, and it is trying to make that 18% gray. It's assuming that thing is 18% gray, not neutral gray for color, but 18% gray exposure. It's going to try to do that whether it's my black shirt or this white wall behind me or my skin tone, whatever. Your meter is going to try to make that gray, which means that if you were to put your meter directly on my black shirt and use the meter in the camera, in theory, I might be overexposed because my face is lighter than my shirt, right? However, when you look at me, you can see that my face is properly exposed. My shirt, while being black, is black. I mean, that's what color it is. And the reason why that is a few things. Number one is that when you think about an image and an exposure, you need to consider what you're photographing. That is, if you're photographing a white wall, it should be white. A black shirt, it should be black. If you're photographing somebody whose skin tone is mine, it should record. When you're looking at the image, it should look like my skin tone. If you're recording somebody with lighter or darker skin tone, it should look correct for them. Okay, so early cameras that mostly used a center meter, right? They would tell you, okay, if you're going to make a portrait of somebody, let's say with dark skin, you want to overexpose a little bit, or otherwise, or underexpose, I should say, because what's going to happen is it's going to overexpose them. This isn't as big of a deal anymore because cameras have very sophisticated metering systems. They can look at this situation and see white, black skin tone and make a balance of the exposure. Is it always perfectly right? No, you still have to make an adjustment, obviously, to your eye or whatever is correct, but generally speaking, cameras are very good if you put it on the more general metering system. Another thing that you can do is go real close to something in the shot, frame it up tight, don't worry about exposure or composition, set your meter, and then come back and frame it up. This would be useful if you were photographing, let's say, somebody who in very dark clothes, let's say, against a very dark space, and they had very pale skin. Done this in videos before. So essentially what would happen there is because most of the frame is very dark and we want to keep it that way, the camera doesn't know that, right? So we've got to make an adjustment for that. So why are we having problems then? Why is it that when we make a photo of somebody with, let's say, particularly dark skin, as was the case in this, and particularly light skin in the photo, sometimes it's hard to balance it out? That has to do with the dynamic range of your camera and the dynamic range of the photo. People love contrast. As such, most cameras, when they're shooting JPEGs, especially in like a portrait mode or whatever, pump the contrast up. If you go back to, if you've ever shot black and white film, if you go back to like the proper way to shoot black and white film, you really should be shooting it flat. The idea there is that you shoot a relatively flat exposure, and then when you're in the darkroom, you make adjustments to then bring out, you make your black blacker and your white whiter. You don't want to shoot something where in the photo you're blowing out or losing detail, because you might want to bring that back, right? Same is true. RAW files help a lot with that. Modern cameras are much better at this. However, if you're not shooting RAW, or even if you are and you're shooting, let's say, with an older camera or one that doesn't have such a great dynamic range, how can we ensure that we don't have a problem here? It's going to vary camera to camera, but I'll give you some general advice. Go into your camera if you're in a really contrasty situation and take it off portrait mode. Put it on the most neutral or flat that's available. Yes, when you're looking at the back of the camera, they're going to look kind of flat, but you want that detail. It's better to have it be flat there and then go into your Photoshop or your Lightroom or whatever, Capture One, and pump the contrast up, then have it lose detail, right? So we're going to go into our cameras and we're going to set it when we're in a contrasty situation. We're going to set our camera to be sometimes called natural, even go beyond that. If there's a flat setting, do that. If you can individually adjust the settings, go in there and adjust it. Make as flat a profile as you possibly can. In fact, a good way to do this, most cameras allow you to make your own profiles and save them. Do that ahead of time. Go out somewhere where it's real contrasty and with a friend, and make a profile that is the flattest possible profile. This is going to give you much more range when you get your image back in your computer, basically, to tweak it. Even if you're just going to directly send it to your phone, you can always tweak it in the phone and add contrast and stuff, right? But at the point of capturing, at the point of getting that image, you want to shoot it as flat as possible. So if I'm shooting a group of people and they're very skin tone and I cannot control the light enough to make it really perfectly even on all of them, and I feel like I'm going to have an issue, that's usually when this comes up, right? It's like at parties or you're outside or whatever, so you don't have total control. Try to put the person in the light with as least contrast as possible, so it's flat as possible. Try to flatten out your image as much as possible in your profile. It also doesn't hurt to do a couple of, bracket your exposure a little bit. Whenever you get somebody in front of your camera, you're always going to shoot a handful of them, right? So shoot a few a little bit brighter than you think, shoot a few a little bit lighter than you think. One of those will be right around the same spot, and hopefully you get a good shot in each one of those brackets. One tip that I learned from a photojournalist early on was they would actually use the motor drive. This is back in the film days. They would actually use the motor drive, and whenever they took a portrait, they didn't shoot the way I shoot with my medium format camera, like bang, when it's the perfect expression. They would go, and they would do that so they had a little bit of a bracket, so they could mess around with it. So they'd get a couple of options. So set your camera on automatic exposure bracketing, like a third of a stop or half a stop, depending on your camera. Shoot in three shot bursts. Typically this is going to happen when it's really contrasty, so it's usually when it's really dark. So if you are using flash, it's not going to be a problem because you're not using a lot of file power. But ultimately what you want to do is try to achieve the flattest image in camera as possible. Flat light, flat profile. Then when you get it in camera and the person with the darker skin looks a little bit lighter than they should and the person with the lighter skin looks a little flatter than they should, you pump that contrast up, boom, now you've got an image that works. Okay, you can look at your histogram, but it can be tricky with people. You have to really understand how to work a histogram to really figure it out, but it doesn't hurt to make sure that you're not really at the edges. Try to keep it as flat as possible so that your main image is kind of in the middle. If you're going to use that, again, I would just get used to using my screen, create a very flat profile, and you should be good to go. If you guys have other tips or you don't understand what I'm talking about and you need more information or you want to see me actually do this or create a profile, let me know. I can do a video about that. Let me know what other questions you guys have, and I'll be back next week. Until then, I'll see you.